I've always believed that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones in horror movies. They're the ones who live quietly right next door. The ones who wave when you walk by, who host birthday parties, who smile just a little too easily. This is the story of one of them. John Wayne Gacy wasn't a shadow lurking in the dark. He was a respected businessman, a party clown, a volunteer, a man who shook hands with politicians and parents alike. And for years no one had any idea what was happening inside his home. But beneath the surface, under the floorboards of a modest suburban house in Chicago, he was hiding a secret so dark, so brutal, that it would change the way America understood evil forever. In this episode, we're diving deep into one of the most disturbing cases in true crime history, not just to examine what happened, but to understand how it happened, and why no one stopped it sooner. This is not just a story about murder, it's about masks, about manipulation, about a system that failed again and again until it was far too late. This is the story of John Wayne Gacy. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Man. Everyone thought they knew you know. Sometimes I wonder how well we ever really know the people around us, our neighbors, our co-workers, even the people we wave to at charity events or see volunteering at hospitals in clown costumes. I think we all want to believe that we're good judges of character, that we'd recognize a monster if we saw one. But this story, it changed the way I think about all of that. Because today, I'm going to tell you about a man who was trusted, respected, and even beloved in his community. A man who hosted backyard barbecues with hundreds of guests, who entertained sick children dressed up as a clown, and who for years got away with some of the most horrific crimes imaginable, all while wearing the mask of a model citizen. His name was John Wayne Gacy. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's probably because you've heard it whispered in the same breath as the word serial killer. But before the world knew what he really was, John Wayne Gacy was known as a hard-working businessman, a loving son, and an active member of his community. People trusted him. They shook his hand. They let their kids sit on his lap. But behind closed doors and eventually beneath the floorboards of his own home, a very different story was unfolding, one that would leave dozens of families shattered and an entire country asking the same question: how the hell did no one see it coming? I've spent a long time going through this case. The documents, the interviews, the survivor accounts. And let me tell you, it's not just the crimes that are terrifying. It's how many times the system failed to stop him, how many people looked away, how many red flags were dismissed because he smiled the right way, wore the right suit, said the right things. And honestly, that's what chills me the most, that someone so terrifying could hide so easily in plain sight. In this story, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning. We're going to look at how John Wayne Gacy was raised, what shaped him, and how the boy who grew up terrified of his own father became a man capable of burying the bodies of young boys under his crawl space like they were nothing. This is not just a story about murder, it's a story about deception, about vulnerability, and about the people who paid the ultimate price for trusting the wrong person. So if you're ready, let's begin with the boy behind the name. The one born on a quiet day in March, who would go on to become one of America's most infamous serial killers. This is the story of John Wayne Gacy. Chapter 2. The Making of a Monster. When I first started digging into John Wayne Gacy's early life, I expected to find trauma. That's almost always the case in stories like these, not as an excuse, but as a pattern. What I didn't expect was how early it began, how deeply embedded the damage was, and how many people had the chance to stop it, but didn't. John was born on March 17, 1942, St. Patrick's Day in Chicago, Illinois. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a World War I veteran and a mechanic. His mother, Marion, was quiet, nurturing, and religious. From the outside, they looked like a normal working-class Catholic family living in a modest neighborhood. But inside that house, there was a very different reality. John grew up in a home ruled by fear and by his father's fists. His father drank heavily and carried a deep resentment, one that seemed to leak into everything he touched, especially his only son. While John's two sisters were spared the worst of it, he bore the full weight of their father's rage. And it wasn't just physical abuse, it was emotional warfare. Name-calling, mockery, constant humiliation. John was never strong enough, never man enough, never good enough. His father would beat him, call him names like sissy or queer, and then sometimes, in the very same breath, accuse him of being weak for crying. The irony of punishing your child for the pain you cause them. It's heartbreaking. But that's the kind of household he grew up in. To make matters worse, John had a congenital heart condition, one that caused him to faint often and limited him from playing sports or roughhousing like the other boys. His father, instead of being concerned, took this as more proof that his son was defective, that he wasn't a real man, and that just fueled more beatings. John tried to earn his father's approval. He worked hard around the house. He tried to stay out of trouble. But nothing ever seemed to be enough. His mother, Marion, would try to intervene. She was his only safe space. But every time she stepped in, the beatings would get worse and the insults more cruel. And that's just what happened inside the home. Outside, John didn't fare much better. He was socially awkward, often overweight, and isolated from other kids. He lacked confidence. He had no real male role models. He was desperate to be accepted by anyone. And that desperation made him vulnerable in ways that would shape him for life. Around the age of 5, John said he was molested by an older girl. A few years later, he and a friend were caught fondling a young girl in the neighborhood, and when his father found out, he beat him mercilessly. But the trauma didn't end there. By the age of 8, John was being regularly molested by a family friend, a man who would take him out for ice cream, teach him wrestling moves, and then abuse him under the guise of play. And still John said nothing. He couldn't. Because in his world, pain was supposed to be kept quiet. Speaking up meant more pain. Admitting something happened would make him responsible in his father's eyes. So he kept the secret buried. And like most secrets that involve shame and power, it festered. There's one detail that always stuck with me. John once told his father he didn't want to hang around that family friend anymore. He didn't say why. He just said he didn't feel comfortable. And that was it, the only boundary he ever set. His dad didn't ask questions and nothing more was done. No confrontation, no support, just silence. And that silence, it became a pattern. That inability to communicate, that repression of fear and anger, it didn't go away. It just grew more complicated. By the time he was a teenager, John had developed a habit of hiding everything he truly felt. He became a people pleaser, a performer. The guy who smiled, obeyed, and told people what they wanted to hear, especially authority figures, especially men. Because deep down he was still chasing approval, still craving control over the pain that had always controlled him. By 18, John dropped out of high school and left home. He moved to Las Vegas and found work at a funeral parlor. And I wish I could say that was the beginning of a better chapter for him, but it wasn't. In fact, it was there that something truly disturbing happened. Something that he would later admit was his first real sign that something inside him had broken. He was allowed to sleep at the funeral home, and at night he'd sneak into the embalming room and lie down beside the bodies. There was one incident where he climbed into a coffin with a young man's corpse and lay there holding it in the dark. Even Gacy himself later admitted it felt like something had shifted in that moment. He said it shocked him, like something had clicked that he didn't fully understand. And instead of seeking help, he ran again. He called his mom, asked to come home, and within weeks he was back in Chicago. Just like that, Las Vegas was behind him. But the darkness he carried, the unresolved abuse, the anger, the shame that followed him back. Because the truth is, trauma doesn't stay in childhood. It grows up with you. And in Gacy's case, it didn't just follow him, it became him. And the world hadn't seen anything yet. Chapter 3. The Smile Behind the Mask. When John came back from Las Vegas, it was like nothing had happened. No one knew what he'd done at the funeral home or what he'd felt in that coffin. He didn't talk about it. He never really did. He just moved on, or at least he pretended to. He enrolled in business school, got himself a degree, and started working for a shoe company. On the surface, it looked like he was turning his life around. Clean slate, fresh start. That was a pattern with him, always performing, always trying to wear the right face for the crowd he was in. And people liked that about him. He was charming, enthusiastic, eager to help. He volunteered. He smiled big. He told good stories. He had this way of making people feel important, like they mattered. That's what made him so dangerous later on. But at this stage in his life, it just made him seem like the guy who had finally figured it out. When the company asked him to transfer to Springfield, Illinois, he didn't hesitate. It was there that he joined the JCs, a leadership and service organization that helped young men develop business skills and make connections in the community. And Gacy. He jumped in headfirst. He worked long hours, volunteered for everything. He rose through the ranks fast, eventually becoming vice president of the local chapter. People admired him. He was only in his early 20s, but he spoke like someone older, someone who had already lived a lot. In a way, he had. It was around this time that he met Marilyn Myers, a coworker. She was smart, warm-grounded. They started dating, and within months they were engaged. On paper, it looked like the classic American dream, a young couple with promise, a man with a career and a growing reputation. But behind closed doors, things weren't quite so clean. Even before the wedding, John confessed to Marilyn that he'd had a sexual encounter with another man, something he claimed happened during a night of drinking with other JC members. He said it meant nothing, that it was a mistake, a fluke. And Marilyn, whether out of love or denial, forgave him. They got married in 1964, and shortly after her father offered John a job managing several KFC restaurants he owned in Waterloo, Iowa. The offer was lucrative, respectable. It gave John the kind of legitimacy he craved, not just money, but status. And again, he played the part perfectly. In Waterloo, Gacy thrived. He joined the local JC's chapter, brought buckets of fried chicken to meetings, asked people to call him the Colonel. He was hosting events, giving speeches, shaking hands. To the outside world, he was a model citizen, a young husband, a father. Marilyn gave birth to a son and then a daughter in quick succession. For a moment, it seemed like everything had clicked. Even his father, the man who'd spent his life mocking and abusing him, came to visit. And something happened that John would talk about for the rest of his life. His dad pulled him aside, shook his hand, and said, "I was wrong about you." For someone like Gacy, who had spent years trying to prove he was worth something, those words meant everything. It was like validation washed over all the wounds. Or at least that's how he saw it. But underneath all the success, something darker was growing. While John was busy playing the part of husband and businessman by day by night, he was building a different world in the basement of his home, a sort of makeshift club where young male employees from the KFCs would come to drink, play pool, and hang out. John supplied the booze, the drugs, the porn. It didn't take long for the boundaries to blur. He began grooming these teenage boys, buying their trust with alcohol, money, and attention, and then slowly he'd test the waters. A sexual comment here, a dare, a joke that wasn't really a joke. If anyone resisted, he laughed it off. "Relax, I'm just kidding," he'd say. But he wasn't. This was the first real glimpse of who Gacy really was, a man who used charm as a weapon, who studied people's insecurities and exploited them, who created environments where people let their guard down and then took what he wanted once they did. In 1967, that mask finally started to crack. He invited a 15-year-old boy, the son of a fellow JC, over to his house, told him they'd play pool, hang out. The boy ended up drunk, watching porn and being sexually assaulted. Gacy told him that men had to practice on each other before they could be with women. Manipulation wrapped in authority, and that boy somehow had the courage to tell his parents. Within weeks, Gacy was arrested and charged with sodomy. But of course, he denied everything, claimed the boy was lying, claimed it was a setup. He even demanded a polygraph test, which he failed badly. In court, he eventually pled guilty, though he insisted the teenager had come on to him. No one bought it. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but here's the part that still keeps me up at night. John Wayne Gacy served just 18 months of that 10-year sentence. 18 months, and then he was back on the street, smiling, rebuilding, rebranding. What the system didn't know or chose not to believe was that they hadn't just let a man out of prison. They had let a predator go free. and the worst was still to come. Chapter 4: A Second Chance for a Killer. When John Wayne Gacy was sentenced to 10 years in prison for sexually assaulting a teenage boy, it felt like maybe, finally, some kind of justice was being served. He was exposed. His secrets were no longer whispers. People in Waterloo saw the headlines. His community knew. His wife filed for divorce almost immediately. She took the kids, moved out, and cut all ties. And I don't blame her. She had no idea who she had married. But here's where things take a turn, not just in the story, but in the system that allowed this story to become a nightmare. Because despite pleading guilty to sexually abusing a minor, despite psychological evaluations that labeled Gacy a potential threat, despite it all, he served only 18 months. 18 months out of a 10-year sentence. He wasn't released because he changed or because he showed deep remorse. He was released because he was good at playing the game. In prison, Gacy was on his best behavior. He got involved in community projects, organized events, even became head cook in the prison cafeteria. He smiled, he charmed. He acted like he'd been rehabilitated. And the parole board believed him. So, in 1970, John Wayne Gacy walked out of prison, a free man with no public record of his conviction in the new county where he moved. It was like his past had been erased, like none of it had ever happened. And just like that, the clock started ticking. He moved back to Illinois, into his mother's house in Norwood Park, a quiet neighborhood just outside of Chicago. The kind of place where people still borrowed sugar from their neighbors and waved from their porches. No one there knew his history. No one was warned. And once again, Gacy got to work rebuilding his image. He started his own business, a construction company called PDM Contractors. The name stood for painting, decorating, and maintenance, but to him, it stood for independence. Control. He hired mostly young men, teenagers, really, for low wages and long hours. He said he was giving them opportunities, teaching them skills. But behind closed doors, it was the same pattern all over again, grooming, manipulation, power. Around this time, Gacy also joined the local community in a big way. He became active in the Democratic Party. He hosted fundraisers, shook hands with city officials, and even had his photo taken with the First Lady Rosalynn Carter. Yes, that Rosalynn Carter. He even wore a Secret Service pin on his lapel in the photo. That part always makes my stomach turn, knowing a man capable of such darkness stood smiling next to a First Lady, as if he belonged in that world. But the most bizarre part, the clown. Around 1975, Gacy started dressing up as Pogo the Clown, his own invention. He performed at hospitals, parades, birthday parties. He said it made kids smile, that it brought joy. But there was something deeply unsettling about it. The makeup he used, the sharp angles, the exaggerated mouth, it wasn't the soft, rounded style most clowns wore. It was harsher, edgier, more manic than merry. People would later say the same thing, that even in costume, something felt off. And while all of this was happening, the business, the politics, the clown act boys started disappearing, one by one. The first known victim was a 15-year-old named Timothy McCoy. Gacy picked him up at a bus station in 1972. The boy was trying to get home. Gacy offered him a place to stay. The next morning, Gacy stabbed him to death. He later claimed it was self-defense, that the boy had walked into his room with a knife. But when police eventually found Timothy's body, they discovered the truth: the knife was from Gacy's own kitchen. The boy had been making breakfast. He was just trying to say thank you. That murder, according to Gacy, changed everything. He would later describe it as the ultimate thrill, the feeling of having someone's life in his hands. That moment, he said, was when he realized he could get away with it. And he did. No one suspected him. No one questioned the sudden disappearance. There was no pattern, yet no headlines. Just a boy who vanished without a trace. And a man who felt more powerful than ever. Over the next few years, Gacy refined his tactics. He lured boys with promises of work. He offered them money, alcohol, drugs. Some were runaways. Some were kids from broken homes, all of them vulnerable. And when they walked through his front door, they never walked out again. He buried them in the crawl space beneath his home, layer by layer, body after body. As horrifying as that is, and believe me, it only gets worse, what chills me the most is how ordinary everything looked from the outside. Neighbors said he was friendly, helpful. They saw young boys come and go, but never asked questions. Some even joked that his house always smelled a little weird, but no one pressed, because no one ever thinks the monster lives next door. That's the part that stays with me. How easily evil can blend in. How we tell ourselves that bad people must look bad or act strange or give off some kind of warning. But Gacy didn't. He laughed, he told jokes, he handed out balloons, and he was building a graveyard under his feet. In the next chapter, we'll talk about how the murders escalated, how the crawl space filled up, how he started running out of room, and what happened when the bodies could no longer stay hidden. Because the smiling man in the clown suit, he wasn't done yet. Not even close. Chapter 5. The crawl space beneath the smile. There's something uniquely terrifying about someone who looks you in the eye and smiles while hiding the darkest parts of themselves just beneath the surface. That was John Wayne Gacy. Charming, helpful, always willing to lend a hand. And yet, every time he waved to a neighbor or flipped a burger at one of his infamous backyard parties, there were bodies decomposing just a few feet below his home. By the mid-1970s, Gacy was killing regularly, efficiently, almost like it was part of his routine. He had a pattern and he stuck to it. He'd drive around at night or pick boys up at bus stations. Sometimes he'd offer them a construction job. Other times it was just a party, a place to crash. Some of the victims were runaways. Others were kids whose families thought they were staying at a friend's. And that's what made it easier for him. They were boys no one looked for right away. When they got to his house, it probably felt harmless at first. Gacy was friendly. He'd pour them a drink, crack a joke, show them a pair of handcuffs, and say, "Want to see a trick?" And if they agreed, if they let him cuff one wrist, that was it. Because then came the line, the one he used over and over again. The trick is, you have to have the key. And just like that, the mask came off. He'd overpower them, beat them, torture them, strangle them with a rope twisted like a tourniquet. In many cases, he sexually assaulted them before and even after death. And then he buried them. He buried them in the crawl space under his house, a dark, shallow area, beneath the floorboards, where no one could hear a thing. He kept track of where each body went. He once drew a map for investigators showing the layout of his victims' remains, almost like it was a project, a blueprint. Sometimes, when the crawl space started to get full, he'd wait. He'd stop for a few weeks or months, not out of guilt, but out of logistics. The smell became unbearable. He'd pour lime or concrete, crawl down there himself and rearrange the bodies. It was mechanical, practical. There was no remorse. That part is hard to sit with, because it shows you how detached he was, how this wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of madness. It was deliberate, rehearsed, controlled. And yet, upstairs, everything looked fine. He still threw parties, still put on his clown makeup and danced around at hospitals, still showed up at political events and fundraisers flashing that big, goofy smile. Sometimes I think about the people who sat next to him during those dinners, the kids who waved at him in costume, the officials who shook his hand. How many of them ever stopped to wonder? But then again, why would they? Gacy went out of his way to seem normal, more than normal even. Generous, charismatic, successful. And when people live in that illusion, they don't want to look too closely. It's easier to believe that evil looks like a monster, not like the guy mowing your neighbor's lawn. And because no one looked too closely, he kept going. By 1976, the number of victims was climbing, one after another. Some were buried, others, when the crawl space got too crowded, were dumped in the Des Plaines River. There was no clear motive beyond power, control, domination. He didn't pick his victims based on who they were, just that they were available, vulnerable, alone. It's the kind of randomness that makes your stomach turn, because there was no safety in numbers, no way to stay safe once you were in his house. The second that door closed, he was in control. And he liked it that way. There was one case, though, one that haunted me while researching this, where a boy actually managed to escape. Jeffrey Rignall. In March 1978, Gacy picked him up near downtown Chicago, lured him into the car, drugged him, and brought him back to his house. What Jeffrey went through over the next 24 hours, it's unspeakable. He was restrained, tortured, assaulted, and left in a park barely alive. But he remembered the car, and he remembered Gacy. He went to the police desperate to press charges, and you'd think this would be the moment, the turning point. But nothing happened. The investigation stalled. They brushed it off as a he said situation. And Gacy, he just kept smiling. It's hard to think about how many boys died after that moment. How many lives could have been saved if just one officer had listened, had taken the report seriously. But that's the story of this case over and over again, missed chances. By the time someone finally looked close enough, there were 29 bodies in his crawl space. 4 more dumped in the river, and several others never found. The house on Summerdale Avenue looked ordinary. The man inside it played the part of a good neighbor. But what lay beneath the surface, both literally and psychologically, was something we still struggle to understand today. And the scariest part, no one saw it coming. In the next chapter, I'll take you into the investigation, the moment when someone finally connected the dots. The missing boy, the red flags, the police work that finally pulled back the mask, because even the best disguises eventually crack. Chapter 6. The boy who wasn't invisible. It wasn't a tip, it wasn't a grand FBI sting or some breakthrough in forensics. It was just one mother asking a simple question. Where's my son? On December 11th, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Piest walked out the back door of the Nissen Pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. It was cold that night, snow on the ground, Christmas decorations in the windows, and Rob was supposed to be helping his mom pick out a new camera for her birthday. But before he joined her, he mentioned something. He told a co-worker that a man had just offered him a construction job, said it would pay twice what he made at the pharmacy. Easy work, good money. He was just going to talk to the guy real quick, and then he'd be right back. He never came back. That small detail, that offhand comment about the construction job, would become the thread that unraveled everything. Because that man was John Wayne Gacy. And Robert Piest wasn't like some of Gacy's other victims. He had a stable home, a family that noticed right away when he didn't return, a mother who didn't take he probably ran away as an answer. She went to the police that same night. She pushed. She demanded action. And thankfully this time, someone listened. Detective Joe Kozenchak was assigned to the case, and right away he took it seriously. He interviewed Rob's co-workers, followed up on the construction guy, and when he learned that man was Gacy, a local businessman with a record for sexually assaulting a teenage boy back in Iowa, the red flags were immediate. But Gacy, as usual, played it cool. When police first came to his house, he was polite, confident. He denied ever meeting Robert, said he was at his office all evening. Even offered to come down to the station later, just to clear things up. But the moment the detectives left, he started acting nervous. He called his lawyers, he began cleaning, destroying receipts, throwing things away. Something wasn't right. The police didn't have a warrant yet, but they were watching. And while they waited, they started digging, talking to former employees, checking records, looking into the growing list of missing boys who had passed through Gacy's world. The pattern was finally taking shape. On December 13th, just 2 days after Rob went missing, police got their first search warrant. They entered Gacy's home, the modest ranch-style house on Summerdale Avenue, and what they found wasn't enough to arrest him, but it was disturbing: a fake police badge, a pair of handcuffs, pornographic films, a syringe, several driver's licenses that didn't belong to him, and a strong, strange smell coming from the heating vents. Still, it wasn't enough. Not yet. So they kept watching him. They followed Gacy everywhere, set up surveillance, 2 teams, one on him at all times, the other digging through his past. And the more they looked, the worse it got. They started connecting the dots: boys who had worked for him, boys who had last been seen with him, names that kept coming up, stories that mirrored each other. And the whole time, Gacy knew he was being watched. He started unraveling, At first, he tried to charm the officers, invited them into restaurants, cracked jokes, bought them dinner. He was trying to stay in control. But slowly, he started slipping. He drank more, slept less. His behavior got erratic. He started confessing not to the police, but to friends, to neighbors. He'd say things like, clowns can get away with murder, and then laugh. It was only a matter of time. On December 21st, Gacy invited one of his surveillance officers to breakfast. And out of nowhere, he said, "You know, you're really good at your job. You've been watching me all week." And then he added, "You'll get your man." By that afternoon, police had enough evidence to get a second warrant, a deeper one. This time they went into the crawl space, and what they found was beyond anything they expected. Human remains, bones, the unmistakable stench of death. The nightmare was real. Over the next several days, crews would uncover 29 bodies from under that house. 4 more were found in nearby rivers, and several others are still missing. When Gacy was arrested, he confessed almost immediately. Bragged even. Said it was 30-something boys, but he wasn't sure exactly how many. Like they weren't people. Like they were numbers in a game. He drew diagrams, showed where the bodies were, told stories like they were anecdotes from a bizarre dinner party. And suddenly the smiling man in the clown suit was gone. In his place stood a predator, stood a calculated, cold, shameless. And yet, the scariest part wasn't just what he did, it was how long he got away with it. How many chances were missed, how many people ignored their gut, how many victims were dismissed because they were young or poor or gay or troubled, how easily society looked away. Robert Piest wasn't invisible. He was seen. He was loved. And because someone noticed he was missing, because someone fought, the truth finally came to light. But it came too late for 33 others. In the next chapter, we'll talk about the aftermath, the trial, the evidence, and how the justice system handled a case so large, so horrific, that it's still being studied today. Because once the crawl space was empty, the courtroom filled up. Chapter 7. The Trial of a Killer Clown. There's something surreal about seeing a man on trial for 33 murders and watching him smile through it. When John Wayne Gacy was finally arrested and the bodies started coming out of the crawl space, the world was stunned. Not just because of the scale of the killings, but because of the image they had to reconcile. This man, this neighbor, this volunteer clown, was now one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The media called it the House of Horrors, and honestly, that's exactly what it was. But what came next was something else entirely, a legal battle that would drag on for years, filled with chilling testimony, psychological warfare, and a man who refused to show even a flicker of remorse. The trial began on February 6, 1980, more than a year after Gacy's arrest. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, spectators, survivors' families. People wanted to understand. They wanted answers. But what they got was a performance. Gacy pled not guilty by reason of insanity. He didn't deny the murders. In fact, he openly admitted to killing at least 30 young men and boys. But his defense claimed that he suffered from multiple personality disorder. That the man who killed wasn't really John Wayne Gacy, it was someone else inside him, someone darker, detached from reality. They claimed that Jack, one of his alleged alternate personalities, was responsible for the killings, not John. And while that might have been compelling in another case, the problem was, Gacy was in control, every single step of the way. The prosecution came in prepared, and what they laid out over the next 5 weeks was staggering. They brought in testimonies from survivors like Jeffrey Rignall, the man who'd managed to escape after being drugged and tortured. They had dozens of witnesses, former employees, neighbors, acquaintances, all piecing together years of missed signs. And then there was the physical evidence, photos, maps, bones, personal belongings from the victims found buried or hidden throughout Gacy's house, and journals, his own notes, drawings of the crawl space, labeled diagrams of where he buried each body. This wasn't the chaos of a man out of control. This was cold, planned, methodical. The prosecution's case boiled down to one devastating truth. Gacy knew exactly what he was doing. He chose his victims. He lured them. He tortured them. He buried them. And he went on with his life like nothing had happened. And the jury saw that. They listened to everything, the testimony, the psychological evaluations, the gruesome details. They even heard from Gacy himself, who rambled for hours on the stand. At times defiant, at times bizarre, he called himself the most misunderstood man in America. He talked about politics, food, art, anything but the victims. He never cried, never apologized. On March 12, 1980, after just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all 33 counts of murder. And then, they sentenced him to death. In that moment, it felt like a weight had dropped. Justice at last, for the families, for the victims, for a community that had unknowingly lived beside a monster for years. But Gacy. He wasn't done performing. Over the next 14 years, he filed countless appeals. He gave interviews, long, delusional interviews, where he blamed the victims, the media, the police. He insisted he was innocent, even as he talked in circles about the bodies under his house. At one point, he claimed he was simply running a cemetery. He also took up painting dozens of eerie, childlike portraits of clowns, skulls, and Jesus. He signed them and sold them. People actually bought them. Some collectors still do. It's disturbing how we sometimes turn killers into icons, into curiosities, how we remember their names more than the names of the lives they destroyed. But the families never forgot. For them, the years of legal back and forth weren't abstract. They were excruciating. Every delay felt like another wound. Every headline was a reminder of what they lost: a brother, a son, a child who never got to grow up. Finally, on May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center. His last words, "Kiss my ass." That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement, just defiance all the way to the end. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered, some holding candles, others celebrating. There were signs, cheers, silence, rage, relief. It was all there. A strange blend of justice and grief, because even though Gacy was gone, the damage he left behind could never really be erased. 33 confirmed victims. But the truth is, the real number may be higher. Some bodies were never identified. Some young men, runaways, drifters, were never reported missing at all. There may be names we'll never know. Faces lost to time. And that's what haunts me most. Not just what he did, but how long he got away with it. How easily a man with the right smile, the right handshake, the right costume, can fool the world. We tell ourselves we'd know, that we'd see the signs, that monsters look like monsters. But sometimes they just look like the guy next door. Chapter 8. Echoes that never fade. Even after the trial, after the headlines faded and the interviews stopped, the story of John Wayne Gacy didn't really end. Because how do you end something that left this much damage? You don't. You live with the echo of it. I think about that a lot. About how a man like Gacy could slip through so many cracks over so many years, and how so many lives were lost, not just because he was evil, but because people weren't paying attention. Or they were, and didn't want to believe what they were seeing. That's the legacy he left behind, not just the horror, but the questions. The uncomfortable truths about the way we see others, and about how systems can fail the very people they're meant to protect. After Gacy was executed in 1994, there was this moment where the public, and especially law enforcement, had to sit with what had happened. This wasn't just a serial killer story anymore. It was a case study in failure, a warning about what happens when we ignore red flags, when we dismiss victims because they don't fit some idealized mold. Many of Gacy's victims were runaways, queer youth, or teen boys estranged from their families. Some of them were never reported missing. Others were dismissed as probably just off partying or troubled, and that's what made them perfect targets. Gacy knew that. He counted on it. He preyed on the fact that no one was looking, that no one would care fast enough. And so part of the aftermath of this case was realizing how vulnerability can be weaponized. That predators don't always jump out of the shadows, sometimes they show up in a suit and tie. Shake your hand. Paint your kid's face at a fundraiser. It changed how law enforcement worked with missing persons cases, especially when it came to young boys. It wasn't enough to assume they'd come home. Investigations had to start earlier. Profiles had to be built. Communities had to take every disappearance seriously. In fact, the Gacy case played a key role in the evolution of criminal profiling. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, yes, the same one you hear about in Mindhunter, began studying Gacy's patterns to help develop what we now call the serial killer profile. They looked at how he lured his victims, how he maintained a double life, how he covered his tracks. That information helped shape the future of forensic psychology and investigative tactics. But there was something else that lingered, something harder to quantify: trust. Gacy didn't just break laws, he broke trust. He broke the illusion of safety in the suburbs. The idea that you could know someone because they were part of your church, or your local political group, or your community barbecue. He was everywhere, and yet no one saw the truth. That shook people. It made them more cautious, made parents look twice, made communities rethink what safe really meant. And while that caution probably saved lives down the line, it came at a terrible cost. But here's what I keep coming back to: the families, the ones who never got to say goodbye, the ones who had to bury pieces of their children decades later. Some victims weren't identified until the 2010s using DNA technology that didn't even exist when the crimes were committed. Imagine that, waiting 30, 40 years to know what happened to your child, to get a name, a grave, a sliver of closure. The Cook County Sheriff's Office actually created a task force in the 2010s to re-examine Gacy's unidentified victims. They exhumed remains, collected DNA. They invited families of missing boys from the 70s to submit samples. And slowly, names started coming back. Timothy McCoy, William Bundy, James Hawkinson. Each one of them had a story, a face, a family. They weren't just victim Nutcher 19 or bone fragment A. They were kids, and for too long they were treated like footnotes in someone else's story. That's why we tell these stories. Not to glorify the killer, not to give the monster more airtime, but to remember the names, the faces, the lives that were stolen. Because the moment we stop remembering, the moment we reduce them to just another true crime case, is the moment we risk repeating the same mistakes. And here's the truth: Gacy didn't happen in a vacuum. He was enabled by a system that didn't listen, by people who looked the other way, by assumptions about what evil looks like and who deserves protection. We owe it to every victim, to every family, to do better, to listen harder, to believe sooner, to act faster. In the end, Gacy may be dead, but his story still teaches us. It still warns us. And for many people, especially in Chicago, it still hurts. It's easy to say he was a monster, but the harder and more honest thing to admit is that he was human, and that makes it so much worse. So here we are at the end of a story that still doesn't feel real. A man who dressed up as a clown for children's parties, buried 29 bodies beneath his own home. He smiled for cameras. He blamed his victims. He lived a double life that fooled an entire community. But in telling his story, we're not just looking at what he did, we're looking at what allowed him to do it. The warning signs that were missed, the victims who were overlooked, the silence that let him keep going. We owe it to those boys, those young men, to say their names, to remember who they were, and to never let them be reduced to a headline or a statistic. If there's anything to take from this case, it's that real evil doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it looks normal, friendly, even fun, but it hides behind charm, behind community roles, behind the walls we want to believe in. And if we're going to protect people, especially the most vulnerable, we have to start seeing past the smiles. Thank you for joining me on this deep and difficult journey. If you found this story important, if you believe in remembering the victims and learning from the past, I invite you to subscribe, share, and keep the conversation going in the comments. This has been True Crime Echoes. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and never stop asking questions.